Welcome to part 4 of our teaching series, How to Wage Peace, Overcoming Fear and Understanding Why We Make Enemies. Today I invite you to listen in on a conversation I had with Cynthia Wallace. Cynthia, or Cindy, is an English professor at the U of S, and she's a researcher in the areas of religion and literature, post-colonial literature, women writers, and literary ethics. I have found her to be exceptional, and I think you will too. I invited Cindy to talk to us a little bit about the power of stories and how understanding our story and the stories of others is essential to peacemaking. Oh, and one more thing. Due to some COVID-related complications, we were unable to conduct this interview in person, so instead, we recorded our conversation over Zoom. And you love Zoom, right? Of course you do. All right, here we go. Hi, Cindy.
Hey, Joe.
Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us and for investing.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So good. So good. Are you ready for the first question?
I am. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, here it is. So why is it important for us to hear and to understand other stories, especially if their story is different than mine? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. So before we get there, I want to clarify what I mean when I'm talking about peace to make sure we're on the same page.
Sure.
When I think about peace, and especially kind of biblical peace, I'm thinking about not just kind of surface calm, but this really robust flourishing of everybody. And that peace can't be separated from righteousness and justice. So I'm thinking about this kind of Hebrew idea of shalom, and I'm thinking about righteousness and justice and peace as kind of parts of the same kind of thing, the same goal. I like to think of a metaphor sort of like this is like what waters the kingdom of God. Yes. So I thought I'd start, does that align kind of with
Absolutely.
What you've been talking about?
Overlaps perfectly with what our past guests have said and things that we've talked about at Lakeview already. So perfect.
Great.
You're good so far.
Yeah, good. So the question of how we get from here to there, I think, is one of the big questions. And as a person who studies literature, I think a lot about stories. And stories, unfortunately, I think can get us out of trouble, but they also get us into a lot of trouble. So when we think about a lack of peace, we think about conflict, what gets us there is often a quest for power, right? We're like power over land, power like authority, even just like the power of who's in control of like what's happening in our neighborhood or our household. And one of the ways we justify taking that power for ourselves is the stories we tell. And a lot of the times we don't tell great stories about other people. And so we tell stories in many cases when we're seeking power that oversimplify other people or that make them kind of our polar opposites. Like that's what people say when they're talking about othering. So if I'm holy, this other person or this other group is not. Or if I'm rational, this other person is overly emotional, right? So we have these dualisms we set up. And it's sort of how we're wired as humans to tell stories, to make sense of things. I tell my kids stories to teach them morals and to kind of help them understand how the world is, but it gets us into trouble. So I think sometimes of the example, I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and my family had lived in the city proper, like my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And the stories that I heard growing up about why the family moved out of the city to the suburbs in the 1970s when there was racial tension in Detroit shaped how I understood African-American people for a very long time. And I had to undo a lot of those stories and how deeply they had formed my assumptions in my adulthood. Now, I've talked to a lot of people in Saskatchewan who have similar stories to tell about how they, as settler people, kind of learned to see Indigenous people based on not like explicit teaching of the adults around them, but these kind of implicit, widespread stories that they had been kind of taught as kids. I don't like, does that feel true to you, Joe?
It does, but like where my mind goes right away then is, well, is there any hope then? Because once stories are locked in and settled and formed,
yeah,
is it too late, or can you change those narratives and thus change the way we approach others and their stories? What do you think?
yeah. So this is where, like I said before, stories get us into trouble, but they can also help us get out of it. The Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie has this incredible TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story, where she talks about how in many cases, sometimes even these kind of bad stories that we learn as kids, it's not, the problem isn't just that they're not true, it's that they're so one-dimensional that we develop these stereotypes. So maybe our problem isn't even that we like think less of another people group. It's that we can only see their suffering. That's one example she gives, like for people from Nigeria, where we're like, that's not an authentic African story because it's about people, like middle-class people flourishing. There were editors who would say to her, like, this isn't an African story because she wrote about her like comfortable, affluent life, right? So we get these expectations. So the fantastic news is that there are so many stories to be found. And especially now, we have so many ways to access better and more diverse stories of people that maybe we don't know a lot about, or that maybe we have developed kind of biases or prejudices against. So as a lit prof, like I definitely think immediately of, you know, novels and poetry and short stories and the books I assign in my classes. But if you're not a reader, like it's like you can find documentaries, right? You can listen to podcasts. You can seek out stories of places that you maybe weren't thinking about. An example I've been thinking about is like, how often is our Canadian news coverage of COVID just about Canada? Like, do I know what's happening in Ecuador? Do I know what's happening in Nepal? You know, like we can go looking for stories that disrupt our kind of tunnel vision, but also that complicate our picture of people that we maybe learned to think badly of. So,
and that's good. And use a key word again that's shown up over and over again through this series is like disruption, meaning you break out of a cycle, you see it from a different point of view. But my two questions back to you would be this: why should I care what COVID is doing in Ecuador? And then beyond that, whenever I hear another story, someone else's story, and this could just be me, I don't think it is, but I quickly go into comparison mode, right? Is their story better than mine? Have I had it harder than them? Or I read somewhere recently where it's like, sometimes we get into these kind of discussions, and I'm always comparing my best to your worst. So then we put those stories together, it's always lopsided. So why should I care is my question to you. And then what do I do with these comparisons that bubble up naturally?
Yeah, that's so good. I like why we should care. Like to begin with, I mean, you could make an argument about our shared just kind of human decency. But I think the reality is that as Christians, we are called to love our neighbors. And the story of the Good Samaritan teaches us that our neighbor, it's not about who's next to us, right? It's about who we come across. And we live in a globalized world. Nothing we do in Canada is without consequence on the other side of the world. And so because we're so intertwined in that way globally, it's become the case that our neighbor includes the person on the other side of the world, right?
Right.
That's a little overwhelming.
It is.
But
not that it feels new, but we might be the first batch of humans to really live in a globalized, right?
Yeah. And that, I think that carries with it certain responsibilities. I mean, not that every person can do everything, right? We're not called to like to shoulder the weight of the world. That's not what we're called to. But if we're getting stories that kind of make us biased against certain people on the other side of the world, we probably then have the responsibility to seek out stories to balance those. So I think the call to care is rooted in our kind of Christian commitment to love. And I mean, and to love our friends and to love our neighbors and to love our enemies, which is it's an extraordinary call. So that's the start of an answer to your first question. What the second one was about, the comparisons, hey? Yeah. That's a hard one. I do think it's important to remember that these discussions of peace and justice and responsibility, we do have to keep power dynamics in mind. So I think that when we have certain privileges, like the privilege of the kind of economic stability we enjoy here in Canada as kind of settler people with an education and employment, we have these privileges bring responsibility. And I think sometimes it's really hard not to create hierarchies of suffering and to be like, well, that's so much worse. Like, I shouldn't feel bad about my stuff, or my stuff is so much worse. What's their problem? And there's not, like, everybody's living at the center of their own life. There's not a way. I don't think there's a way. I haven't found a way, and I study suffering. I haven't found a way to quantify suffering. Like, when you're in the middle of it in your own life, like that's your life. But the question becomes, how do we find a way, instead of becoming so self-centered that we can't honor other people's experience, how do we actually use those experiences of our own to open out into relationship? And I do think that, like, paying attention to other people's stories, whether in person or like in many of the forms of media available to us, is one way where we can begin to make that connection between our experience and somebody else's. But it might just take some discipline not to play the comparison game. I don't know. Have you found any strategies, Joe, that you found helpful in that?
Listen, I'm doing the interviewing here. For questions. Strategies. I would just go back to what you had said before, right? Like, so if I'm called as a disciple of Jesus to love, then it has to neutralize those comparisons, and it has to neutralize my feeling of, well, I don't really care. I don't feel like I should have to care about that. So strategy, no. Calling, maybe that'd be a better way that I would frame that for myself.
Yeah.
So that actually creates a pretty good segue to the second question. Let me read it to you. So it's easy for us to become so wrapped up in our own stories that we cut ourselves off from the wonder that exists in the stories of others. So how do we open ourselves up to that wonder and to the humanity of others who are made in God's image, when unfamiliarity and preset opinions and those stories, like you said, seem to get in the way? How do we do it well? What do you think?
This is such a great question, and it leads me to the other thing that I really care about. So I study literature. As I said, I think about suffering a lot. But I've also, in the past couple of years, been reading a lot of neuroscience about empathy. And one of the incredible things is that we are wired as humans to feel, and we are wired to feel with other people. And this is the most basic definition of empathy, right? Empathy is feeling with someone else's feelings. That's not necessary, like, it doesn't necessarily have a value. It's just what we do as humans. It's built in us. But as followers of Christ, this means that we are literally built to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice. And that, I find that really encouraging, because it means that this command is something we already have the kind of capacity to do. It's kind of like in the structures of our brain. And we do it all day long. Like, here's an example. We do it even from birth. So those who've had babies will maybe remember that when their infants are really young, if you get right in their face and you maybe like stick out your tongue, they might do it back to you, or they might smile back at you before they're really consciously smiling, because their brains are made with mirroring capacities. Or like when you're watching a TV show, I love to give this example because it makes fun of my husband. But when you're watching a TV show and there's like a really intense conversation happening, you might find that you've been like nodding along with the character or like mimicking their body language. My husband does this way more than I do. He has really active mirror neurons, I think. But it's a reminder that we are built to do this. And we do it not just in person, but like watching TV, we're watching fictional characters on a screen. It also happens, brain research shows that kind of mirroring is happening when we read stories or hear them. So there's this immense potential coming back to the stories again. So this is part of how I understand God's image in us. But it's also really beautifully told in the story in John's Gospel in chapter 11, when Jesus' friend Lazarus has died. And everybody will probably remember, everybody comes, Jesus is like, hold on. And then he gets the news that Lazarus is dead. And he says like, well, I mean, I'm kind of glad this happened because it'll show God's glory and your faith is going to be grown. I'm going to bring him back to life. Like Jesus knows how the story is going to end. Sure. He knows that there's something good coming. And still, when he gets to Bethany and his friend Mary comes out and is crying at his feet, and all of the people around her are mourning, he weeps. And this story, it's this incredible example of Jesus, who as Christians we believe to be God incarnate, right? Weeping with a friend, even though he knows that the story is going to end not in death, but in life. Right. So like Jesus, I mean, if we can think about this neurologically, Jesus has some mirror neurons firing, which thinking about like God having neurons it blows my mind. Yeah. Whoa. But I feel like it baptizes our human experience of feeling and feeling with. And it shows us that there's something really holy in taking the time to let ourselves weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. Even if we have the faith that things are going to get better, or even if we have another perspective.
Yeah. And when I'm hearing you talk about this mirroring effect, two quick examples from my own week sort of pop up, and they're framed as, a vibe that I send out and a vibe that I receive. So let's do the receiving one first. I was with a gentleman yesterday who was explaining to me a heart-wrenching story. As his eyes began to water and his voice started to shake, my eyes began to water, and it changed how I was sitting, holding myself in that room, and it happened automatically.
Yep.
So I received that, but I also recognized that I send vibes out. So another example, confession, you and me, I'm driving, I feel like somebody has done me wrong, and my road rage kicks in, and I lean on the horn. So I've started something, and then that reaction happened in the car in front of me, and the dude slams on like his brakes. So I'm coming in like really close. So then for you and I, when we think about stories and other people, whether we agree with them or not, whether their stories is like us or not, these vibes that go out and these vibes that we take in, as Christians, do you think we are responsible to expose ourselves to other stories, expose ourselves to other people? And then what do we do with those feelings that we receive and those feelings that we emit? What do you think?
Yeah, like I think, at least for me, like I've been exposed to certain parts of Christianity that don't have a lot of room for feelings. And where we sort of like, it's very rational, very in our mind, or we like bracket the hard stuff. And I think that this story about Jesus reminds us this is what it is to be a human. And it's not just that we're going to mirror good feelings or like just like kind of sad feelings. We're gonna mirror anger. It's all there. The question of what we do with that, I think, is a really important one. And it brings me to this other point about feeling with that I think is really crucial. So number one, like just because you feel with somebody doesn't mean you're going to do right to them. And so we can just kind of wallow in shared feeling without ever seeking justice or righteousness or peace. So that's one warning. Sometimes it just feels good to feel, and then that's as far as we go. But also there's the risk of kind of that swell of like anger that can happen in a room. There's also a risk that we won't feel with people that we should be feeling with. And this is one of the areas of research that I'm really interested in, because we have this rigorous command to love everybody, including our enemies. And they're throwing out maybe anger at us, and we're tempted to just like throw anger back. And the bad news with mirror neurons is that when we have prejudice against somebody, or when we have anger against somebody, the capacity in our very brain structure to feel with them in a way that increases kind of good empathetic development, it's blocked.
Really?
It's blocked. And it can be blocked in ways that we're not even aware of. So there's research, they research this in laboratories. And there's research, for instance, that in the United States, a white person who sees another white person pick up a cup will have more mirroring brain activity than a white person who sees a person of color pick up a cup. And those results are worse in cases where people have recognized prejudice.
So what's what can we do?
It's kind of scary, right? Are we stuck? That's the question, right? Like, are we stuck because, I don't know, we're called to love. We're called to love people who we think of as our enemies, but also people who maybe we don't realize it, but there's a conflict with. But if our brains are kind of tripping us up before we're even consciously aware of it, what are we supposed to do? So there is more good news. I love that. I love, with God, I feel like there is always more good news. Yep. There's more research that suggests that if we can pause when we're faced with somebody who we think we might have a bias against, or when we're faced with somebody that we fear, or that we know we have prejudice against, or just somebody that we're kind of mad about, and we imagine their favorite vegetable, what's happening in our brains literally shifts. And what's happening there is that we're engaging our minds in a kind of meditation on their humanness. Okay. Right? So if I'm confronted with somebody that I have a problem with, and I'm like tight in that like give and take of anger, if I can take like 5 seconds to think like, well, I wonder what so-and-so had for breakfast today. Yeah. It shifts me out of that space of just confrontation and conflict. And it moves me into a space where I can begin. It's like the first tiny step in being able to recognize that they are a full and complicated human. And that might be the first step that takes me into a space where I could begin to even meditate on the fact that they are a child of God. Yes. But first, thinking like, I wonder what they want for dessert tonight. Like that's an easier step to take, right? Yeah. So like scientists study this stuff in laboratories. It's incredible.
And what I think I'm hearing you say is, we get to like a silly example like that, like what did you eat for breakfast? What that removes is who you are, where you're from, what your story is, what my story is, and it brings us right down to the common denominator, which is you're made in the image of God, I'm made in the image of God. We're both humans. We're part of this like global family, even though we're different in so many other ways. Really, at the end of the day, we likely have more in common than we have difference.
Exactly. That's just right. That's absolutely it. Yeah. And there's this fascinating research that suggests that people in Nazi Germany who helped Jews, who risked themselves to help Jews, saw their humanity, like bracket everything else. The ones who helped and who resisted the Nazi regime were the ones who just saw the simple shared humanity of the Jewish people. And that sense of shared humanity was the thing that kind of provided the foundation for them to provide this incredible self-sacrificing care, which is what love is, right? It's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's working for someone else's flourishing.
All right, one more question. Cool? I want to tie this back to our idea of like waging peace. So the question is this. So we know that peace is a priority for Jesus. And so my question to you is, how do we embody God's peace in our interpersonal conflicts and the conflicts that we experience and observe daily and locally?
Yeah, that's so good. So it's easy for us to think about peace like in terms of war and international conflict. And I think it's also easy for us to imagine how if I have a more complicated, nuanced story of another people group's humanity, I am much less likely to make war against them or colonize them, as another example, right? But the small and local and interpersonal is also really important here. So I've thought of some examples, starting really tiny, back to the babies. If I imagine that my 3-month-old, if the story I'm telling myself is that my 3-month-old is crying to manipulate me because of their total depravity and sin nature, that story heightens a conflict between us, right? And I'm going to respond really differently than if the story that I'm telling myself is that my 3-month-old is using the only kind of communication they have to convey something to me, right? And so the interpretive stories we tell, they matter. Now that story is a little, well, maybe it's not neutral, but it's little. Very similar things can happen with, say, like our spouses, where the story that we're telling maybe isn't very generous when we kind of explain their behavior to ourselves and the conflict that we have. And so Brené Brown, the psychologist, she talks about getting curious about somebody else's story. So instead of just saying like, oh, this thing is happening and it follows this pattern and I'm so familiar with it, here's the story, like stepping back and saying, hey, what's really going on here? That's a very concrete practice. It's not necessarily easy, but it's something that we can do to shift our own mental process and move us out of a space where we're just kind of stuck in a conflict into a space where we can work toward mutual flourishing. If I'm in a conflict with my neighbor over the dandelions on my lawn spreading to theirs, which is a thing that happens, or something else, and we're frustrated, right? Or like a person at work that I just find difficult. If I start by using that trick of imagining like, I wonder what kind of ice cream so-and-so likes, when I'm in that space of sort of activated frustration, that can actually shift us into a different space. So what I'm talking about there is using both this sort of empathy practice and also complicating the story, and those two things really working together. If you, Joe, in traffic, thought about the person who frustrated you and like told yourself a story, even just a made up one of like, maybe that person had a bad day, maybe that person really needs to go to the bathroom and is in like a rush, like we can tell stories that move us out of a space of unnecessary conflict and into a space of just less frustrated antagonism. So those are some things that we can do in our just daily lives.
All right. So like, I like what you're saying. It makes sense. And I feel like when I can control the situation, right? So I can, control myself and plan to be generous. I can plan to be kind. I can put all these structures and things in my life to make sure that I'm a good person, loving Jesus, etc. But in the moment, I don't care if the guy driving has to use the facilities. I don't care if they're in a rush because I'm in a rush. I have a call of nature. I have to do things. So how do I prepare myself for those split-second moments that I can't prepare myself for, really? What do you think?
It's such an essential question, I think, because if we think about this kind of call to love and we think about the call to peace and we think about it as like white knuckling our way through our discipleship, there's not going to be any joy there. We're just going to fail a lot. The good news, though, is that I've been talking about the way like our brains work. The good news is that the more we immerse ourselves in better stories, the more we practice that pause before reacting, it gets kind of built into the structures of our brains. And so the more, this is what discipleship is, right? This is why our faith calls us to engage in habits. I think about this sometimes as taking every thought captive, which is a kind of a military metaphor now that I think of it. Yeah. But the more we practice pausing and imagining somebody else's humanity, imagining a better story, the more we take in other people's stories and begin to kind of internalize caring for people outside ourselves, the easier it becomes. And it becomes that way because our brains change, which is, again, I feel like really encouraging news, because we are called to a rigorous discipleship, but God doesn't call us to things that God doesn't also equip us to do. Like, we're not called to something impossible. We're called to something difficult. And also we are equipped by the Spirit to do it. And we are created structurally to have this capacity. So here are some other things that we can do to kind of steep ourselves in a better way.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about social media. So on social media, one thing that we can do is resist the urge to reduce everything to a meme, because memes, they appeal to the most primitive parts of our brain that are rooted in fear and anger. And the more we engage that part of ourselves, and the more time we sort of stew in anger and fear, the more natural it's going to be for us to go to those responses in other situations, right? So this isn't about like a head in the sand approach. What I'm talking about is, instead of like hot takes and like quick, angry kind of reactions that make us feel good for like 30 seconds and then make us feel kind of terrible.
Yeah.
Engaging in like the kind of more complicated, nuanced discussions and debates and understanding. So if we're getting most of our news from like sound bites, we're probably not engaging in the more complicated, better stories.
Yes.
That's hard to take in, because a lot of the technology is structured to be really short.
Yes.
And sometimes that's what fits in. And so there's a way in which we're kind of going against the way our society is increasingly built. So it's countercultural. But I think if we want to love, and if we want to love our enemies, we have to have more nuanced understandings of where they're coming from. So that's one thing. Another thing, I mean, like seeking out different news sources, curating our Instagram feed so that there are more diverse people, right? Like, I'm a white lady. I have to work to make sure that I am looking into the lives of people who are different from me, who maybe share interests, but have other kinds of diversity, right? Like, that enriches my understanding of what humanity is, right? Finding ourselves spaces that aren't just echo chambers. You know, if you're a reader, reading a book outside your normal genre, or reading a book by an author who's like kind of different from what you usually do, watching movies that are kind of a little bit further afield, basically switching it up so that we don't keep in the space of tunnel vision, but we begin and kind of grow in the recognition that God created an incredibly rich and diverse world. And it's not just like me and them.
Right.
It's us.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's good.
Does it seem possible though, Joe? Does it sound too hard?
It doesn't sound too hard, but it makes me take a step back and realize you're right. A lot of my news or whatever is processed in sound bites or one line or two line or a quick picture or a meme. And I've gotten so used to process stories that way that sometimes I'm frustrated when things are taking too long. Okay, quick. And I do that with my kids. Just get it out.
Oh yeah, sure.
I don't right? But I think what you're saying is so right as we, like you said, you curate your social media feed, but you're also recognizing that, hey, there is way more to this story, way more to this person than what I'm just seeing in this tiny soundbite while I'm looking at my phone, eating a cheeseburger, going through the drive-through, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So very helpful.
And it's about finding people that we maybe only ever think about their suffering, finding stories of their resilience and strength, right? Like people, it's about finding not just the diversity of different human experiences, but finding the complexity in people's stories and taking the time. And again, the incredible news is that this is all circular. So the research suggests that the more we do this and immerse ourselves in these more complicated, better stories, the more naturally it comes to us to recognize other people's full humanity. So these practices, they're not just about following a trend of inclusivity. They're tools that can help us pursue God's heart for peace and justice. So, Joe, can I talk about the Bible a tiny bit?
Allow it, sure.
So if we're disciplines or disciples in this lifelong kind of task of grappling with what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies, empathy and telling better and more complicated stories I think they can really help us in that. Eugene Peterson talks about a long obedience in the same direction, right? It's not like we're not gonna be incredible experts at this next week. It's a lifelong practice. But the more that we engage in it, the more it becomes easier for us to live with the kind of holiness that loves. And again, not just dwelling in warm, fuzzy feelings, but working toward other people's flourishing. And so again, justice and peace being two sides of the coin. So Jesus gives us, again, this incredible example of weeping with those who weep. I love that the story of turning water into wine, right? The first miracle in John is a story of rejoicing with those who rejoice, right? He shows us the gamut. And so both of these stories are really embodied and communal. But I also love what Paul writes about Jesus in Ephesians chapter 2, when Paul says that Jesus is our peace. And Jesus destroys dividing walls of hostility. And Jesus reconciles all people to God through the cross. And through the cross, even further in Ephesians 2, Paul writes that Jesus, I'm looking at my notes to make sure I had this right. Jesus put to death the hostility between Jews and Greeks in the cross. And he preached peace to those who are far and to those who are near, which I feel like that can take us back to this globalization question. We are called to love those far and to love those near. We are called to live in the reality of peace that Jesus already made. And those who he calls, he equips through the Spirit. And that equipping is enlivening these built-in capacities that we are created with to begin with. Yes. And so there's this beautiful, it's almost like coming home to the way that God made us to be together. It's like a redemption of our humanness for us to see each other's humanity and to care for each other in this way, which that feels to me like kind of some of the most excellent news about how we can live together in the world.
Absolutely. And I think you nailed it with the word you just used there, that built-in capacity. And you've talked about this whole interview where what's built in, how I see someone else, the story built in scientifically, biologically, how does my brain work? And then as Christians, we take scripture to heart and we build that into who we are. Yeah, you're right. We can do this. I'm hearing you say we can do this.
We can do it. We can do it. We're called to it and we're empowered to do it.
Amazing. Cynthia, thanks for sharing your time and your wisdom with our church community. And I'm really, really thankful that you did this for us today.
It
Thanks.
was my pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation, Joe.
Okay, let's quickly summarize some of the big ideas from our conversation with Cindy. Number one, the lack of peace is ultimately a quest for power. Two, widely accepted one-dimensional stories are dangerous. Three, immersing ourselves in better stories expands our awareness. Four, telling generous stories shifts us out of conflict. And five, when we open ourselves to the wonder of other people's stories, we unlock our capacity to empathize. Wow, lots there. Allison, what can we do with all that we've just learned?
So this week, Cindy basically did my work for me. She gave us so many practical tips for becoming peace builders and avoiding one-dimensional stories about other people. Because black and white stories keep other people in boxes and as a result, keep us from experiencing connection and empathy with one another. Those stories keep us from doing the sacred work of building peace. Now, the purpose of the practices that Cindy shared with us is to complicate and expand the one-dimensional stories that we have about other people. And here's a reminder of the tips Cynthia gave us for how to do that. First, read and engage the stories of people who have a different experience than you from their perspective. Pay special attention to those you've been told only one story about, or you've only heard a photocopy of their story, never from their mouths, but from other people interpreting their story. For instance, like most of you, I grew up on the prairies. In fact, I grew up in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, next to one of the largest reserves in Canada. I grew up learning a one-dimensional story about Indigenous people. I had Indigenous classmates and walked by Indigenous people every day on the street, but not once did I hear their story from their own mouths. And I have had to complicate that story by learning about Indigenous spirituality and reading Indigenous authors and theologians and absorbing the stories of residential schools and treaties and the Indian Act and the unique character of each separate nation within Indigenous populations. There's so much to learn, and sometimes it's really uncomfortable because I have to admit I don't understand or I've gotten it wrong, or because I can't make sense of things. But I have also been inspired and have reimagined what God is up to in the world because of the new stories I have heard. And I've also made new friends. So here's a really practical thing to do. Just read some books by Indigenous writers. We're going to put some on the list of resources this week so you know where to start if you're feeling new to this. And if they challenge you and feel uncomfortable, that's good, because it means you're complicating the story. And when you hear a story that complicates a narrative that you hold about someone else, rejoice. Allow the narrative to be complicated, because complication in another's story opens you up to listen and learn, and therefore opens you up to connection and empathy. Here's another helpful thing that I heard Cynthia say, but I've also heard from others. Read stories that highlight the joy and not just the suffering of others. When we hear only stories of suffering, it again creates that one-dimensional story, but it also sets up a power dynamic that keeps us from seeing others' shared humanity, because it gives rise to feelings of pity rather than respect. So read stories of resilience. Read about culture and music and food and clothing from other people groups. I've been reading a novel by a woman from Nigeria, set in Nigeria. And as she writes about the Nigerian experience, I am set back again and again to the internet to figure out what's going on. What is a mandrake? How do they prepare it? What is an adire bubu? It's a comfy shift dress that also looks beautiful. What kind of houses do Nigerian people live in? It's teaching me so much. Another practice that Cindy suggested to us is that when you meet somebody that you might find hard to relate to, or you find anxiety or fear rising up in you, ask questions that remind you of your shared humanity. Questions like, what's their favorite vegetable? Remind yourself that while we all have a different experience of the world, we also share so many things. We love, we want to belong, we want to feel safe, we want to be heard, we want to see our experiences represented in the world truthfully. Cynthia's final practice suggestion is this: resist engaging in meme culture, which just means that we resist boiling issues down to 140 characters because life is more complicated than that. You can still share those hilarious Bernie Sanders memes though, because I love those. Take note of your social media feeds. Are they full of one side of an issue? Do you need to open yourself up to new perspectives and ways of seeing things? Seek diverse opinions and viewpoints. Slow down. I'm not a huge social media user, but I do spend a significant time on Twitter, and some of the people I follow, or most of the people, are more progressive Christians. And I have made an effort in recent months to follow more conservative voices I respect, and eliminate the progressive voices that participate in meme culture or are demonizing people who think differently than they do. So, those are the practices that help you complicate the stories that we might tell about other people. But that's a hard thing to do if we haven't faced into our own complicated stories. So here's one final practice for you. Listen to and lean into your own complicated story. One of the ways that we learn empathy is by facing into how imperfect and complicated we are, by making room in our own story for imperfection, for emotion, for wounding, and therefore for grace. Telling our stories helps us to integrate our stories and make sense of them. Camilla Gibb, who is one of my favorite authors, wrote a memoir about the breakup of her marriage. And this is what she says about telling that story. We come to know ourselves only through stories. We listen to the stories of others, we inherit the stories of those who came before, and we make sense of our own experiences by constructing a narrative that holds them and holds us tighter. Stories are how we make sense of our lives. Telling our story is a spiritual practice when we tell our stories to God and invite the death and resurrection of Jesus to reinterpret and include all of the suffering and joys. As we become more integrated and accepting of our own stories, we also become better able to make room for the stories of others. So instructions on how to reflect on and tell your story will be on our website in the resources. It takes time and space to enter into this practice. It also takes quite a bit of courage. And one of the practices is an exercise I do with our baptism candidates on how to tell your spiritual story. It includes reflecting on the significant events at each stage of your life, where you felt feelings of safety and joy, or fear and loneliness, and therefore where God felt present or absent, and then reflecting on themes or repeated patterns and creating a narrative or a picture that helps hold the complications of life. Now, we used to tell our stories a lot more in churches. It was called sharing your testimony. And today, we called it a God story when we shared about the arrival of the Preeb twins. You see, we all need safe places where we can explore and tell our stories, share our joys and sorrows, and make sense of what has happened to us, who we are, and who we're becoming. There's one other resource that I'm going to share on our webpage that involves reflecting on 2020 instead of on your whole life. It's from Alpha Canada, and the man who shares the exercise is one of my very favorite profs from grad school, Daryl Johnson. It involves reflecting on the loss, longings, fears, and hopes that arose from a very complicated year, and allowing God to meet us in the middle of those experiences. So check out our website for those resources. But this week, let's practice building peace by intentionally complicating the storylines we tell ourselves about others and facing into our own complicated storylines.